What would happen if the CEO of a leading airline was denied service by his own staff simply because he wasn't dressed the part? Have you ever walked into a place where a single glance was enough for people to decide you didn't belong there? That morning, Miles Donovan simply wanted to sit quietly in the first-class lounge before his flight to Los Angeles. No one knew he was the founder of NorthJet, an airline with a presence in nearly every major city in America. Today, he wasn't wearing a suit. No name tag, no expensive watch, no urgency in his stride. Just a worn-out dress shirt, a weathered leather backpack, and the same reading glasses he had kept since his early days as an aerospace engineer. When he approached the VIP lounge reception, the staff member didn't fully lift her head. She offered a brief smile and said, "I'm sorry, sir. This area is reserved for first-class passengers with confirmed credentials." No member look-up, no questions asked. Just one sentence and one look, enough to silently eject him from the space. A few minutes later, a younger man in a grey coat arrived, didn't show any ID, and wasn't questioned. "Welcome back, Mr. Cole. Your usual scotch is ready." Miles didn't react. He didn't argue, didn't reveal who he was, and didn't remind them he was the one who had signed off on the operating procedures for that very lounge. He simply pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, the edges worn soft, and wrote down a line. "Access denied. No verification. No smile. Judgment based solely on appearance." It wasn't the first time he had witnessed this. Over the past 10 days, he had quietly observed and documented more than 24 similar incidents. But this was the first time he became the target. And that made him feel something deeper than any data or report had ever shown him. This subtle form of discrimination wasn't an isolated issue. It was a quiet part of the company's culture, something not printed in training manuals, not coded into systems, but present in the way people looked at others, in how they decided who deserved full service and who did not. And Miles knew his journey was only just beginning. 2 weeks before the day Miles Donovan was denied access to the first-class lounge, he sat quietly in his 40th floor office at NorthJet headquarters, gazing through the glass wall where grey clouds loomed over the Manhattan skyline. Reports were spread out like case files, declining satisfaction scores, customer feedback growing increasingly cold. But what troubled him was not in the numbers. It was something intangible, an invisible erosion that no one in the executive board meetings seemed to notice. When Tanya Reyes, the chief operating officer, walked in with 2 coffees, she didn't need to ask to know what he was thinking. "Planning something reckless again?" she asked. Miles didn't answer right away. He looked instead at a photo from 2010, when they had gone undercover as ground staff to investigate an incident along the East Coast line. "We learned more in those 3 weeks in Charlotte than we did in 3 entire quarters of strategic meetings combined," he said softly. Tanya sighed. "You're not that man anymore. Not with the magazines, the conferences, the spotlights." Miles turned to look at the wall full of awards, most of them faded with time. "Many frontline staff have never met me. They only know me from a short onboarding video. That makes me invisible. And when you're invisible, you can see what people never say out loud." Tanya nodded quietly, a reluctant agreement heavy with truth. And so, Miles began to plan. He booked tickets under the name Greg Holston, paid with his personal credit card, no upgrades, no executive privileges, no internal flags. He would no longer be the CEO, just another quiet man in the long line of economy passengers, a man no one would remember and no one would defer to. The only thing he carried with him was a small leather notebook, the one that would become the journal of truth. From Boston to Chicago, and then to Denver, each flight became more than just a means of transportation. They became mirrors that reflected with painful accuracy how people are judged solely by their appearance. Miles Donovan did not travel to assess surface-level service. He watched quietly, studying every subtle gesture, every glance, every pause when a staff member decided whether or not to smile. On the first flight, he saw a woman in her 60s, neatly dressed but pulling a worn suitcase. She was ignored as she struggled to lift her bag into the overhead bin, while a man in a turtleneck with AirPods barely reached for his compartment before a flight attendant rushed over to assist him as if it were automatic. In Chicago, he recorded a similar scene. A young couple in matching sweatshirts were asked to wait while their upgrade was re-verified, even though they were already on the list. 10 minutes later, a gentleman with a Swiss watch and a polished leather bag was ushered into first class without a single question. No one said anything wrong, but the bias was clear. It was quiet, not outright rejection, just a consistent ease reserved for those who looked the part. In his small leather notebook, Miles documented every moment meticulously. Times, behaviors, dialogue, even seemingly trivial details like the width of a smile or how the tone of voice shifted between passengers. He came to recognize something more alarming than misconduct. It was a pattern of behavior that repeated itself, running on instinct and personal judgment, but clearly systemic. In Denver, he deliberately chose a middle seat. On one side, a drowsy college student, on the other, a businessman wearing an overwhelming amount of cologne. When a young mother struggled with a stroller at the gate, no one moved to help. But the moment the well-groomed man behind her appeared, rolling a shiny suitcase, an employee stepped away from the counter to carry his briefcase. On the plane, Miles watched a flight attendant named Diane walk past an elderly man straining with his bag without stopping, only to pause moments later to engage a well-dressed young man in designer sneakers. Everything Miles had sensed in the reports now came to life. Not as numbers, but as a chain of consistent behaviors. And he realized this was no longer about isolated incidents. This was the mark of a culture that had gone astray. Morning in Atlanta began with the dry crackle of airport announcements and the pale flicker of fluorescent lights washing over rows of cold plastic chairs near the boarding gate. Miles Donovan sat silently among the crowd, a cup of black coffee in one hand and his leather notebook, now nearly halfway filled with careful notes, in the other. He did not write in a rush. He simply observed, knowing the familiar pattern would soon repeat itself. Sure enough, an older man in a windbreaker and soft-soled shoes held out his phone, displaying a clear diamond membership. But the gate agent barely glanced before dismissively telling him to wait for his boarding group. 10 minutes later, a young woman in stylish business attire approached. Before she could even show her card, the same agent greeted her with a smile and checked for an upgrade she hadn't requested. Miles wasn't surprised, but he was caught off guard when someone sat beside him and said in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone, "They did that to me last month." The speaker was Darius Monroe, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, a faded coat, and a worn canvas bag. His voice was calm, but his eyes were not. "Sarah, the one in the lounge, picks people like she's casting a role. If you don't look like a first-class passenger, you wait, or you're just turned away." Darius glanced at Miles as if he could read the thoughts running through his mind. Then, without another word, he pulled a folded sheet of paper from his bag and handed it over. It was covered in notes, flight numbers, dates, descriptions, staff reactions. "I don't have time to write novels," Darius said with a dry laugh. "I just record data, and data doesn't lie." Miles studied every line, feeling like he was staring into a mirror. "Have you ever filed a complaint?" he asked. "3 times, Darius replied. "I got the same 3 answers. We're sorry. Thank you for the feedback. We'll pass it along to the relevant department." And then nothing changed. "I don't want privilege. I just want loyalty to be returned, even if I'm not wearing a suit." That line hit Miles like a blade carving straight through his ideals. He nodded slowly, hiding the tightness in his chest. "I understand." Darius narrowed his eyes. "Do you?" Miles didn't answer right away. He simply stared out the window, where a plane was preparing to land, and whispered silently to himself, "I understand. Because I am the one who built the very system that is now failing people like you. And that has to end." The flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles departed 10 minutes late, but Miles Donovan did not mind. He had chosen a seat near the back of the plane on purpose, as far from first class as possible. As the cabin softened under the warm yellow lights and passengers settled in, Miles jotted down 2 quick lines about the boarding staff's behavior before closing his notebook, ready to rest for a while. But the person who sat down next to him changed everything. It was Diane Lynn, a flight attendant from the Denver leg the previous week. Now she was dressed in casual clothes, a Northjet hoodie, jeans, and her hair tied back, looking like any ordinary passenger absorbed in her phone. Miles did not expect her to recognize him, and she didn't. But then he saw the name Victor Lang appear on her screen, a name he'd seen in internal operations records. Before he could react, a message popped up. "Older man causing trouble in ATLL lounge. Looks like a retired professor. Claims to be Diamond, but Sarah made him wait. Flagged." Miles's heart froze. Diane typed quickly. "Handled. Already flagged in the system. Will re-verify ID. If needed, trigger random security." The message ended with a thumbs-up emoji. She closed her phone, adjusted her neck pillow, and leaned back to nap. Miles sat still, as if he had just heard a silent verdict delivered against himself. This was no longer about unconscious bias or isolated behavior. This was a system, deliberately engineered, operating in the shadows through coded messages, glances, and indirect actions. There was no formal document instructing discrimination, yet terms like flag, protocol, and re-verify revealed a covert process that had become standard practice. Anyone who didn't look the part was quietly placed on a watch list. For the first time since beginning this journey, Miles did not just feel disturbed. He felt fury. It was not loud, not explosive, but a cold and silent rage forged by a truth buried too long. And he knew that this truth would not stay buried another day. When Miles Donovan stepped into his penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, he was no longer Greg Halston, the man in a worn shirt clutching a black coffee, silently observing from airport terminals. He took off his reading glasses, shaved his face clean, and replaced the wrinkled clothes with a tailored navy suit and a silk blue tie that had become his signature look over the years. But when he looked in the mirror, he knew the most important transformation was not in appearance. What had changed was inside. His perspective no longer fixed on KPIs, but on the people buried beneath a system he once believed to be fair. The next morning, Northjet's headquarters buzzed as usual. Employees brewed coffee. Mirrored elevators reflected the silhouettes of rushed success. Polished shoes tapped against cold marble floors. But when Miles entered the grand lobby, no one dared approach him. Not because they recognized his return from the so-called executive wellness retreat in Aspen, but because something in his eyes had shifted. On the 40th floor, Tanya Reyes was ready. Personnel files, excerpts from internal reports, and a laptop already connected to the conference screen waited in the boardroom. The meeting's at 11. Legal is on standby. HR has been briefed, but no one knows what's coming, she said. Miles simply nodded, placed his coat on the chair, and opened the first file. Sarah Jennings, the woman who denied him entry to the lounge. Next was Diane Lynn, the flight attendant who flagged his profile. And finally, Victor Lang, the man Miles now believed was the architect behind the refined discrimination embedded into the system after the merger with Everspan. They were not overtly cruel. They did not shout. They never openly discriminated. They were the ones with polite expressions and thin smiles, who silently judged passengers based on handbags, footwear, and appearances. And today, they would have to face what they never saw coming. The executive they quietly excluded was now preparing to exclude them from the very system they helped sustain. The boardroom on the 40th floor was filled with all 12 members, shareholders, legal advisors, 2 veteran former executives, and an honorary founder who had spoken only 3 times in the past decade. But when Miles Donovan walked in, the room fell silent, not because of his authority, but because of the undeniable change in his eyes. He did not smile, did not shake hands, and skipped any polite opening lines. I'm not going to read a report. I'm going to tell a story. And what I'm about to tell you is the truth, undeniable. For 50 minutes, Miles did not lecture like a CEO, but spoke like a witness. From the woman denied assistance in Boston to Darius Monroe, the man who kept a spreadsheet folded in his pocket. Each video clip, each anonymous complaint projected on the screen, revealed one truth. NorthJet had built a system that judged people by appearance and bias, not by loyalty or actual value. When one board member tried to interject, suggesting that this seems like a personal experience, Miles looked up and delivered a single line that silenced the entire room. How do you explain the fact that I, your CEO, was asked to re-verify my ID 3 times in 4 cities just because I wore a $40 coat? No one replied. Then he laid out his demands: immediate suspension of the individuals involved, removal of internal flagging privileges, creation of an independent passenger advisory council, and a mandatory 2-day frontline assignment for every executive each year. That'll be expensive, the CFO said, already calculating. Not as expensive as a class action lawsuit, Miles replied, or as costly as the trust we've already lost. 10 votes in favor, 2 abstentions. The motion passed. As the board members began to comfort themselves with polite affirmations, Miles stood, closing with one sentence. This isn't about saving face. This is about changing the face of this company. By the end of the day, 17 employees had been suspended or terminated. 5 of them were so senior that Miles delivered the decisions himself. When Victor Lang walked into the boardroom on the 40th floor, his confident stride and smug smile bore all the marks of a man expecting to win. What he didn't anticipate was that the person seated silently at the far end of the table was Miles Donovan, the CEO of NorthJet. There was no one else in the room. No assistants, no attorneys, just 2 men and a thick folder placed neatly in the center of the table. I suppose this is about the passenger optimization policy. Victor opened with a half joke, half probe. Miles didn't smile, didn't answer. He simply slid the folder across the table without taking his eyes off Victor. This is about the fact that you flagged over 30 passengers in the last 3 months based on brand-incompatible appearance, about how you expanded override controls at boarding gates and lounges without clearance, and how you directly instructed frontline teams to categorize people based on how they looked. Victor hesitated, his usual arrogance faltering for just a moment. Then he sat down, quickly launching into justifications, claiming it was all for the sake of enhancing the premium experience, that brand recognition prioritization was just another term for service personalization. He even hinted that people higher up would back him. Miles didn't interrupt, didn't flinch. He simply listened, as if letting the man confess his own misdeeds. And when Victor finally finished, Miles Subtoris spoke just once, his voice steady and firm as steel. "You were too confident that no one was watching. But you forgot I've been with this system from the beginning, and I know exactly where the ethical line must never be crossed." There was no argument, no offer for redemption. When security appeared at the door, Victor looked back, eyes searching for some last-minute reprieve. But Miles had already opened the next file. That night, as the airport lights flickered along the distant horizon, Miles stood alone before his office window. His back was straight, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't thinking about victory. He was asking himself one question. What would he need to do next to ensure he never had to witness something like this again? At 9 a.m. Eastern Time, more than 24,000 NorthJet employees across every terminal, from major airports to regional hubs, from cockpits to cargo bays, from ticket counters to check-in desks, looked up at the screens in their work areas. It wasn't to watch the usual in-house promotional video, but to hear directly from the founder, the man who had just returned from a 2-week journey into the silent structure of the very company he once proudly built. On the screen, Miles Donovan appeared in a black suit and white shirt, his sleeves rolled up to the elbow. He used no teleprompter, no printed script, only steady eyes and a voice that didn't need to raise to quiet even the busiest terminals. He began by recalling the humble beginnings of the airline, starting from a folding table, 2 flight routes, 3 employees, and no guarantee the company would survive its first year. He had once served customers with his own hands, carried luggage, apologized in the rain for delays beyond his control. "I didn't build this airline just to move bodies," he said, his voice deep and clear. "I built it to carry trust and respect." Then he spoke about the 14 days just passed, not as a CEO listing achievements, but as a human recounting truths his own system had forgotten. He spoke of Darius Monroe, a loyal customer for over a decade, dismissed simply for not wearing a suit, of the elderly woman who had to lift her own suitcase while being ignored, of the glances, the raised eyebrows, and the selective smiles he witnessed. And finally, of his own disappointment when he realized he had forgotten a promise he made at 19, on a night he slept on an airport bench because no one believed he deserved help. "Today, I remember that promise," he said, "and I will not let it be forgotten again." When the screen went dark, no one clapped, but thousands began to do something else. They listened and they remembered. Because for the first time in a long time, they weren't hearing a command. They were hearing a reckoning. In the world of service, the difference doesn't lie in the seat you purchase, but in how people perceive the value of the person behind the ticket. Miles Donovan's story is not just about an internal reform. It is a wake-up call. If a system that appears to function smoothly can still silently exclude those who don't look the part, then the problem doesn't lie in policy. It lies in the people who carry it out. If you believe that respect should not be a reward but a principle, then like this video and subscribe to help us share stories that awaken awareness like this one. And don't forget to leave a comment with the words "deserve better" if you resonate with Miles's message.